And to answer your question, I think the reason super well-intentioned people doing all the right things produce unequal outcomes is that we live in a deeply unequal society, full of problems that we refuse to face directly if we're not experiencing them ourselves. And that, unfortunately, these tools, when they're not built explicitly to dismantle those kinds of inequalities, end up amplifying them.
This is an important period of time when there's a number of changes that are having a profound impact on the way we live and the way our society is organized at the moment. But I think we're even just now seeing the beginnings of those impacts and have a much, much larger impact in the future. And I think when I look around the room here, when I look around the city in which I'm in, which is Cambridge, we have the capacity between places like digitalHKS and the Harvard Kennedy School, between the law school here, MIT, the Media Lab, the Center for Civic Media, to position ourselves to be a place where critical thinking happens about how the world around us is changing and how we as a society want to be thinking about these questions and how we empower people to be asking these questions to ensure that the future that's created for us isn't created for us but by us. And so I would encourage all of you to go find these types of institutions that are near you, whether they're at MIT or at Harvard or your local community center, and find ways to participate in this debate. I hope that we can become a place that is part of that debate and a place that makes you feel at home to be part of that debate. But please, I encourage you to go be part of that debate because it's happening whether we choose it or not. And I think we have an important role to play in making that happen and making sure the outcome is one that reflects our values and our desires. So with that maybe more serious note aside, I kind of do want to turn to our two speakers who I'm super thrilled are with us. One reason I'm thrilled is they're both just such really nice people. And it's one thing to be smart, and I like that. I want you to be smart. It's helpful. It's good, but being really nice actually is maybe as good, if not more important. And the thing that really struck me in reading your book, Virginia, is like the opening, not even chapter, the introduction, where it really talks about this terrible event that happened to you. And all I could think of was like, wow, she still wrote the book. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, here this thing that you had to overcome and this community that came around and supported you. I was like, it just comes out immediately in reading that this is a person who's filled with love and filled with community and wants to support her partner and find ways to make the world a better place despite all the things that are happening to her. And I was like, this is just an incredible human. And I've known Ethan for a couple of years now, and I can just tell you, you know, get trapped with him at some point if you can. You will very quickly discover he is an incredible human, and it's not just because he's an amazing cook. It's because everybody will tell you that any meeting you ever go to is just better when Ethan's in it. Not because it's a smarter meeting, but because it's a better meeting because the humans in the meeting are better as a result. And so with that said, we have two humanists here in front of us, two humanists before technologists. And so please, big warm welcome to them, and looking forward to what you have to say.
Actually make it extremely clear, I have very little to say. Anytime that Virginia's in the room, letting her talk is the most important thing that I can do. I do just want to say, this is an incredible moment for this book. This is a moment at which people are really asking questions about an algorithmic future. They're asking questions about the future of social services. One noted scholar remarked that as we begin discussing the potential for artificial intelligence to harm people, that Virginia's work should be required reading.
Who could that be?
Yeah, that was me. I just want to be clear, the only reason I'm here is that Naomi Klein couldn't make it. We're going to have a great conversation, but Virginia is such a compelling storyteller that the only way to set this up is to let her sort of tell the story of the book. We're going to have a little conversation about it, and then we're going to open it to conversation with you. So please welcome my dear friend and one of my favorite people to teach and one of my intellectual idols.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. So look at all you. There's a lot of people here. Is there anyone who's got mobility issues who needs someone to give up their chair so that they can sit down? Because like, let's be on the subway here and make sure that people who have trouble standing can sit. No? Okay, well, feel free to interrupt us if that's an issue for you. So I want to start just by saying thanks to some folks. So the Harvard Bookstore, this is so exciting to be here for me. To Ethan, he totally lies about Naomi Klein. He was my first choice. To Vanessa, who did everything that meant that I actually got here. Thank you so much. And then to the sort of institutional sponsors, so digitalHKS and Berkman and the Center for Civic Media, who've been such incredible hosts and supporters. And all of you for spending your Friday afternoon when you could be still at work or drinking or whatever it is you do on Friday afternoon, that you came to hear about the digital poorhouse instead. Says a lot about the moment that we're in, and I hope a little bit about the book. So what my plan is, with the hour we have today, is just to spend maybe 10 minutes telling you a little bit about what's in the book, because I'm just not going to assume that everybody's read it. That'd be great, but I'm sure it's not true. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's in the book. Ethan and I will talk for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions, because I have, like, people give me twinkle fingers if you already have questions you want to ask. No? Okay, a little bit. There's a little bit of twinkle fingers. Okay.
Took a moment for people to get the twinkle fingers.
Yeah, just do this.
We snap here, or this is an academic time. We just interrupt people at random.
Okay, so we'll try to keep plenty of room for questions, because I think the most exciting part about talking to people about the book for me is the sort of conversations that I get into and what I learn. So I want to leave plenty of room for that. But if you haven't read the book, first, I want to just say a little bit about how I came to do this work. So the moment that David mentioned that starts the book, it was an important moment for this, but I was already on the road to this project very much when that happened, when sort of what I had been studying for 10 years happened to me, happened to my family. So one of the really important moments in the sort of origin story of this book is I come out of the Community Technology Center movement and also out of welfare rights and economic justice. And one day in the year 2000, I was sitting in this community-designed lab with some folks in the community who had built it with me. And we were just talking about technology. We were just kind of, shooting the breeze one morning. And I was there with a woman who I call in the book, it's a pseudonym, but I call her in the book Dorothy Allen. And Dorothy and I were talking about technology, and in that conversation, her electronic benefit transfer card, her EBT card, came up. And that's kind of the debit-like card that you get your public service benefits on. And so I was saying, oh yeah, like a lot of people seem to really like those cards. They're more convenient, right? You don't have to pull out paper food stamps, so there's less stigma. And she said, oh yeah, like all that's true. That's really great. She's like, but also my caseworker uses my EBT card to track all of my spending and my movements. And I had that look on my face of just this sort of look of total shock. And so she laughed at me for like a solid 3 to 5 minutes for being so naive, bless her. And then she sort of got serious and she looked at me and she was like, oh, you all, meaning like professional middle class people, you all should pay attention to what's happening to us because they're coming for you next, right? And so this was 18 years ago. And I feel like Dorothy's prediction in many ways has come true. And that's really the moment where I started really thinking about how folks come into contact with, experience, and survive their interactions with new technology tools in the social service system. But I also felt like I needed to understand a lot more about how these systems were working on the ground. And so this book gives you 3 stories, basically. So I tell the story of an attempt to automate all of the eligibility processes for the welfare system in the state of Indiana, which was an experimental project that ran in from 2006 to 2009. I talk about an electronic registry of the unhoused or the homeless community in both Skid Row and South LA and Los Angeles County. A system that's called the Coordinated Entry System, which is actually a very common system now, but was in many ways piloted because of the depth and the intensity of the Los Angeles housing crisis. And that was piloted in 2013. And then the third system I write about is a statistical model that's supposed to be able to predict which children will be victims of abuse or neglect in the future in Allegheny County, which is the county in Pennsylvania where Pittsburgh is. So those 3 stories give us this really nice breadth of experiences sort of across the country, across different services, and across different experiences. But one of the things that was really important to me when doing this work was to take to heart the lessons of Dorothy Allen, which is that the folks who are targets of these systems really know the most about them, are most invested in how they're working, and really have incredibly important stories to tell about how they're experiencing these tools in their day-to-day lives. So one of the frustrations that drove this book for me was, I think we're in the middle of some really great conversations about whatever you want to call it, algorithmic justice, automated decision-making, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, whatever you want to call it. We're having some really great conversations about it, and have been for a number of years. But my frustration is that those conversations often tended to stay very abstract, right? So it was very like science fiction futurism. It's like, well, what will happen when the automated cars are talking to the soda machines, right? And my experience coming out of these communities where people were dealing with the real world effects of these tools right now, I found the abstractness and the lack of concreteness in those conversations pretty frustrating. And so a big driver to this book was to say, like, how would this story look different if it was told from the point of view of the people who are the targets of the most invasive punitive systems. And we'll talk about how I chose the systems maybe a little bit later, because I'd like to talk about that. So that's one thing that I think is a bit different about this book than some of the other work that's out there. And I want to just sort of key up something else that I think is a bit different, which is one of the things that was really important to me in telling these stories was to tell them in their historical context. So I don't believe that you can understand the shape that these tools take unless you understand the sort of policy context in which they're from which they're emerging and in which they're implemented, right? So I start the book with this is a moment we thank my editor, was originally a 90-page chapter on the history of poverty management policy in the United States from 1661 to today.
Who knew that Boston had the first poorhouse in 1662?
1662.
Now you know.
Now you know, Boston. That's one of the many facts that actually stayed in, but 900 for every fact that stayed in was cut out. And if you ever want to know way more about the history of poverty management policy than you ever thought you wanted to know, feel free. I can talk your ear off about it.
That's the spinoff. That's
the next one. That's the next book.
Automating Equality Electric Boogaloo. It's.
Did you just make like a, yeah, okay, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, a Breaking Two joke.
A Breaking Two joke, yeah.
We're the only people old enough to actually get it.
So the historical context is really, really important to the kinds of tools that we get. I think the other thing that we often do when we talk about our newest, sort of sexiest high-tech tools is we talk about them as if they just sort of appeared out of nowhere, like they dropped out of the sky, like the monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and just sort of landed on a blank slate. And of course, that's not true. Like that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the way technology works. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that we're building what I call a digital poorhouse. And the reason I use that metaphor is to really ground these new tools in the history of poverty management in the United States. And there's sort of two moments that are important to understand. I'll be super quick about them because I just warned you that I have a problem with historical detail. One is the moment at which the actual brick and mortar poorhouse emerges in the United States. And that happens in the early 1800s as a response to a major economic dislocation. There's a depression of 1819. And specifically in response to poor and working people's organizing for their rights and their survival following that depression. So you see this moment where economic elites are struggling with a difference that they first articulate as the difference between poverty and pauperism. So poverty is a lack of resources. Pauperism is a dependence on public benefits, right? And so they were like, okay, so what's the problem? Is the problem poverty or is the problem pauperism? And you can probably guess what they picked. What do you think? Pauperism. The problem, right, is not the conditions of people. The problem is that they are asking for help from shared public resources. And so they built this institution, the actual county poorhouse. There was 1,000 of them in the United States. They intended to build one in every county in the United States. That made the conditions of receiving aid so horrifying that nobody who wasn't absolutely at their last on their last effort would go into them. So in order to go into a poorhouse, you had to, if you had the right to marry and vote, not everybody did, if you had the right to marry and vote, you had to give that up. You're often separated from your children, and death rates at these institutions were often 30% a year. So a third of people who came in every year died. So they're pretty horrifying institutions. But the reason that it's important for the story I tell is because this is also the moment where we in the United States decided that what our public service programs should be doing is moral diagnosis rather than being a universal floor under us all. They should be, part of the process should be identifying whether or not the person's poverty is their own fault, right? And so that is part of what I think of as like the deep social programming of these systems. We see that come out in these systems. And there's a second historical moment, the rise of the digital poorhouse, that I'm not going to talk about right now because I'm super excited about it, but you can ask about it later if you'd like. So I just want to also mention, I want to do two things. I want to introduce some people, and I want to just key up some of the sort of things that are the key lessons for me in the book. Like I said earlier, one of the important things for me to be doing in writing this book was introducing and telling the stories of folks who are the targets of these systems. And so in the book, you meet the family of Sophie Stipes, who's a 6-year-old with cerebral palsy, who's thrown off her Medicaid for failure to cooperate in establishing eligibility in the Indiana experiment. You meet Lindsay Kidwell, who's told to not follow through on her constitutional right to request a fair hearing because the computer says that she failed to cooperate in establishing eligibility. In Los Angeles, you meet Monique Tolley, who says that the coordinated entry system is a gift from God because it is how she got housed. And you meet Gary Boatwright, who had less luck with the system and talks about the system as being a place where he feels like he has to incriminate himself in order to get a slightly higher lottery number for housing. And in Pittsburgh, among the people you meet are Angel and Patrick, who are parents and grandparents to 2 small children, who feel like they constantly have to do calculus in their head about what kinds of things they feel safe, resources they feel safe reaching out to, knowing that reaching out to resources from Child Protective Services means that their risk score might go up, which might end in an investigation of their family and their children being, or grandchildren being removed to foster care. And I think there's a lot of things we can learn from their stories. One really important thing is that we often talk about these systems as using data to remove unfair and discriminatory discretion from the social service system. And I want to be straight, like, discriminatory discretion happens in social services. It's been part of what blocked people of color and unmarried women from getting resources they deserved and were entitled to for decades. But there's a particular story about discretion that these tools tell, or the designers of these tools tell, that I think we need to be more thoughtful about. My buddy and very smart political scientist, a guy named Joe Sauce, says that discretion's like energy. It's actually never created or destroyed. It simply moves, right? So one of the stories I tell is how we are aiming at removing discretion from the system by removing discretion from frontline caseworkers, specifically public workers, and that's really important. But what we're actually doing is moving discretion from frontline caseworkers to economists and data scientists and administrators, and that might be something we want to think about before we do it. The second story, a connected story that these tools often tell, is that bias is a result of individual lack of rational thinking. Is like bad feelings or bad misunderstandings of the world expressing themselves. When in fact rational discrimination exists, and bias is often systemic and structural. So one of the things that these tools help us understand is the way you can build a perfectly neutral system that creates unequal outcomes from no bad intention, right? There's no bad intention. There is the society we live in being amplified by tools that are not explicitly built to fight back against that inequality. And then the third thing that I think is really important to take from the stories I tell in the book is every system that I look at, the designers talk about it as an unfortunate but necessary system of triage, right? There aren't enough resources. We have to make really difficult decisions. And so in order to make them fairly, we're going to computerize and digitize the process. And I understand that impulse, right? There are 58,000 unhoused people in Los Angeles County. I live in a city of 50,000 people. So my entire city is homeless in Los Angeles County. And there's only a handful of resources there currently. And the frontline caseworkers are making incredibly difficult decisions. So I absolutely understand the impulse to say, like, let's find a fairer way and also a less difficult way to make these decisions. My greatest fear with these systems, though, is that we're using them as empathy overrides. That there are ways to make decisions that are so hard to make that it should be giving us the information that this is not a decision we should be making, right? It allows us to outsource these inhuman decisions to machines. And that's one of the great fears I have about this work. That said, and I'm going to move on because I've taken up my 10 minutes already. It's actually I don't know if it's an optimistic book. We'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah. But I do hope it's a rousing book. I actually am myself very optimistic about the opportunities to make change right now, both culturally, politically, and technologically. And I'm happy to talk about why and how I get there. But I do think I hope the book is quite honest in laying out the really hard cultural and political work we'll have to do to get at better tech. So that's where I'm going to leave it for now. Ethan and I will talk for a minute, and then we'll take questions from you.
So, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you that in the 3 case studies that Virginia looks at, things don't go well. It turns out that when you build these very large systems to determine eligibility for food stamps or healthcare or housing, bad things happen. So that was your spoiler. But sort of the arc of the book in some ways goes from a system put together by craven, cost-cutting politicians in a no-bid contract, and then we start getting into systems that actually seem to be designed by good people with good intentions, often using methodologies that are exactly what we advocate for, participatory design, elements of co-design associated with this. How do good people get this so wrong? Yeah, right? So as we start getting into systems in LA that have these paradoxical consequences that if you stop drinking, you might become less eligible for housing. In Pittsburgh, if you reach out for help with a kid who's having trouble learning, you may increase your chances of having a caseworker come and investigate your house. How do we end up with these really dangerous consequences coming from, frankly, thoughtful people with good intentions within this?
Yeah. So start with the easy questions.
Yeah. No, the harder ones are further down on the sheet.
So I think it's really important that people understand that if I wanted to write a book that really just scared the pants off of everybody, I could have done that, and it's not this book. I think there are elements of the book that are pretty scary, but if I wanted to just, freak people out, I would have written a book about the Indiana case because it's pretty straightforward. But then in homeless services, I would have written about HomeLink, which is Palantir's crazy black box. Nobody knows what's in it. Same basic system for San Francisco that I look at for LA. Or I would have looked at Eckerd Mindshare in Florida that's doing these algorithms in child protective and again lacks transparency and people don't really know what's in it. It's the same system that Chicago just decided to no longer use. So there's a much more black hat, white hat story that could be told here, and that wasn't my intention at all. The Indiana case, I think I started with because it is a narrative that we're really comfortable with, right? The sort of narrative that Ethan said, which is like craven bureaucrats, greedy corporations, poor and working class people get the shaft, right? Like that's
crazy multi-million-dollar IBM contracts.
Yeah, $1.4 billion contracts, no bid contracts, right? A court case for breach of contract that IBM won, and then not only kept $500 million from the work they had already done, but were awarded an extra $50 million for breach of contract, right? That case is still ongoing 10 years later. Yeah, it's a mess. But the Los Angeles and the Allegheny County cases are really challenging, I think, because most of the things that progressive critics of algorithmic decision making, most of the things we ask for, transparency, right? Some kind of accountability, that it's in a public or at least a public-private partnership, a public institution, some kind of participatory design, some kind of feedback from folks who'll be using the system, like all of those elements are there. And the reason that I did that was to sort of help step people through the sort of story, the narrative that we're used to a much more complicated, both technically and ethically, complicated set of stories that really force us to think about exactly this question that Ethan is asking, which is like, how do you build a system that's technically correct, right? There aren't mistakes in it, that is well-intentioned, that does all the design stuff we ask for, and still from the point of view of targets is really dangerous and makes them really vulnerable. And I mean, I think it's a super frustrating answer often for people, because particularly when we talk about solutions, people often really want me to give them a 5-point plan for like building better technology. They're like, please, we feel guilty now. Tell us how to fix it. And I understand the impulse. But the solutions are much harder than that. And to answer your question, I think the reason super well-intentioned people doing all the right things produce unequal outcomes is that we live in a deeply unequal society, full of problems that we refuse to face directly if we're not experiencing them ourselves. And that, unfortunately, these tools, when they're not built explicitly to dismantle those kinds of inequalities, end up amplifying them. And so it's like having a neutral system in the social services system in the United States is the same thing as saying, like, I left my car in neutral and I don't know why it went downhill. Right? Like you left your car in neutral, you left the system in neutral, and of course it's going to roll down the hill and crash into the hospital.
So,
right?
So maybe this takes us to a conversation we had earlier about triage, and you mentioned triage as the paradigm that sort of comes into this. One of the things that's wonderful in the book is that you unpack this historical idea of scientific charity, essentially the invention of the caseworker, who sort of starts as someone to find out, are you worthy? Are you a deserving poor person? And now, in many ways, feels like it's been turned into a triage case. You know, given that we can only possibly serve a certain number of people, how do we decide whether you are the priority at that point? Is the answer to this the full socialist answer, which is we actually need to smash these systems that are giving us 58,000 homeless people in LA and are restricting so many benefits? Or is there some version of this where this could be done better? Yeah. Is it that the landscape is so badly sloped that we're going to inevitably find ourselves, any system we built, ending up with these unintended consequences? Or is there something about the systems that you're interrogating or the ways in which discretion gets put within a system that's giving us the problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's see. What kind of audience is this? Can I say like the first answer is yes, smash capitalism? Can I say that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
If there's any city in the United States where that can be your first answer, this is probably it. So, yeah.
That's a little bit an honest answer. But I think one of the really important things to understand, why I talk about that triage, how important that triage story is I just want people to understand that triage is a political choice, right? We talk about these systems as if they're simple administrative upgrades, right? We're not actually changing anything politically. We're not changing policy. But in fact, we are changing policy because these systems come burdened with all of these assumptions, moral and political assumptions. If the assumption is that success in welfare is getting people off welfare, then you're going to build systems that kick people off welfare, and that's what happened in Indiana, right? Like, so the metrics for success in the contract were like time to call pickup and like the shortness of the time to completing the case, but there was nothing in there about like making sure people got the benefits that they deserved, right? And it ended up in incredible abuses of the system by the company that kept their metrics looking good, but had really, really horrible effects on people who are looking for help. So triage is a political choice. One of the things that's really important, I think, to understand is that this idea that public services' first job should be to decide whether or not you deserve help is specific to us in this country. I've been doing a lot of foreign press lately, and they're like, so we need like 45 minutes to explain to people how your social service system works before we can talk about your book, because everybody's like, this makes no sense. Like, why would you have to qualify for healthcare? Like, so there's like this really interesting moment for me too in talking about the book where I'm like, of course, this is unusual, right? We are exceptional in this sense that things that would in other places be seen as basically violations of people's basic human rights. You don't have enough food, you don't have housing, you lose your children because you don't have electricity, right? Like your water gets shut off. You don't have medical care. Like all of those are human rights abuses, right? Here we think of them as systems engineering problems, and that's a really different way of conceptualizing political problems. So I do think that a lot of it has to do with the deep social programming of our country, and I will add that that's not just around class, but also about race. So it's about who deserves help has a lot to do with who we think are deserving people, and that has everything to do with our history of white supremacy in the United States as well. But that's not to say that we can't, this is just one other boot on the neck of poor and working people. I don't think that's true. I have seen one of the other great things about talking about this book in public is that people come to me and they say, oh, there's this really cool thing that you don't know about. And I'm like, oh, please tell me. So there have been a couple of systems that I've been made aware of over the last year that I'm super excited about. And the reason I'm excited about them is they start from a values place that, of course, includes efficiency and includes like good system design and speed, but their primary value choice is like self-determination and agency, right? So one of them is, there's a system, these are both in sort of the civil society space. They're both from nonprofits or community organizations. One in Chicago is called M-Relief, M for mobile. And one of the things that's fascinating about M-Relief is they see their purpose as making sure people get everything they deserve, everything they're entitled to. And they've actually had this incredible luck sort of pushing back against some of the state systems. So one of the things they do lots of different stuff, but one of the things that M-Relief does is allow you to give your information to a third party and not release it to the state until you're sure you're eligible. Right, which is a terrifying moment. When my family applied for food stamps, one of the scariest things about that is you go through 900 screens on the computer and you're about to hit send. It's going to release everything about your family to the county and the state and potentially the federal government if it's food stamps. And you have no idea whether you're actually going to be eligible or not, right? So you can't make like a good choice of like, am I okay trading this amount of my story, this amount of my privacy for not getting anything? So one of the things that M-Relief does is it's like a third party that holds the information.
Fiduciary, yeah.
Yeah, it pings the systems and it says like, okay, look, it looks like you're going to be eligible for food stamps. So let us walk you through the rest of this process. And that's a really different kind of a tool than the tools that we're seeing under the policy that has been shaped by the 1996 welfare reforms, where success in welfare means getting people off of welfare, whether or not that means that they move on to something better, right? So there's definitely some like moments of hope. There's also a great system in Baltimore called Host Home, which connects trans homeless folks with housing in private individuals' homes and sponsors to defray the cost of that housing. And what they're responding to is the fact that the shelter system actually serves the trans population incredibly poorly, right? Because their ID gender doesn't always match their appearance gender, and that's an issue in single-sex shelters.
So I want to add sort of a moment of hope, and it's actually very specifically within these sorts of systems that we're talking about. My colleague and dear friend Chelsea Barabbas is doing a lot of work right now interrogating these systems that many of us have just become aware of that determine bail eligibility and basically decide based on an algorithmic risk score whether or not you're worthy, and the quotes are around that for anyone who missed it, of bail. And what she and colleagues are ending up sort of discovering is that that's a terrible idea, and that actually that triage process is the problem, and that what you actually want to do is invest differently in the system, which is essentially ensuring that everybody who's out on bail actually makes it back for their court date. And that in the cost of building this algorithmic system to decide whether or not someone gets bail, you could instead build a system that sends text reminders to people saying, hey, here's your court date, come back for it, and you're a whole lot less likely to skip bail. What I find myself sort of wondering in these systems that you're talking about is where precisely the problem is. Obviously, part of the problem is that we've made a bunch of very ethically difficult choices to support, that we ration healthcare, that we ration social supports. But you and I both know from work in this field that there have been many decades of human beings who behave a whole lot like machines. And now we've taken those rules that those human beings were operating under and literally put them into code. Why is this now, with this conversion from the frontline case officer into the algorithmic decision, why is that so much worse?
Yeah, that's, I'm just going to keep saying that's a great question because you just keep asking great questions. They think it's cheaper. So there's a couple of things I want to say, and I may get around to an oblique answer to your question, but I want to kind of move us to question and answer soon, too.
I was going to shut up after that one.
No, that's okay. We're all good. So I think one of the things that we really are struggling with right now, there's two big things that we're really struggling with that impact these systems. One of them is the criminalization of poverty. Right. So one of the things, like, I think the clearest example of this is in Los Angeles, the coordinated entry system. It works by having unhoused people fill out this very, very intensive and very invasive survey called the VI-SPDAT, the Vulnerability Index and Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. Can you tell I've done that before? So that you fill out the VI-SPDAT, and it gives you a vulnerability rating, basically, in order to prioritize the most vulnerable people for housing. And that's actually a great idea in many ways. Yeah. The issue is that the questions by which you establish vulnerability are often questions about things that ask you to incriminate yourself. Right? So in the survey are things like, are you currently trading sex for money, right? Do you have unprotected sex? Have you thought about harming yourself or someone else? Are the police looking for you? Is there somebody who thinks that you owe them money out there, right? And because they have so few resources currently for the unhoused in Los Angeles County, only a tiny percentage of people who go through this very invasive process then get any kind of resource on the other side. So they've managed to survey, by the time of the writing of the book, they had surveyed 39,000 people. Only 9,000 people have gotten any kind of resource at all, and that's not like an apartment. That can be, help fighting an eviction or like moving costs if you get evicted, right? So, and any kind of resource is in that 9,000 folks who got resources. And so that leaves 30,000 people who have done this survey once or twice or 3 or 4 times. A survey that, at least in theory, is supposed to be kept absolutely secret from everyone else, because of course, once you start to use an algorithm to make decisions, you have to at least attempt to have it be opaque, because as soon as people know what's in it, it becomes gameable, right? But of course, it's also on the internet, and unhoused people spend a lot of time in the library, so they all know what's in it, right? But I think the real issue there is like folks like Gary Boatwright who say, look, like my suspicion is that they're just asking me to incriminate myself, and that I will end up in jail, and that doesn't have to happen, but part of the design of the system is that though people sign a really sort of intense informed consent form, they have to request a second set of forms to receive the list of organizations that their data is shared with. Turns out and they're unhoused, right? So it's actually really difficult to get people paper when they're unhoused. Turns out that the information is shared with 168 different agencies. And that their informed consent is valid for 7 years, and that even if you request to be expunged, some of your data stays in the system. And the capper being that parts of that information, not all of it, only limited parts of it, but some of that information is then available to the LAPD with no warrant process, just based on an oral request, right? So it makes sense that people are feeling suspicious about what the actual intention of that program is.
And just to remind you, this wasn't the worst system.
No, this is a pretty good one.
Yeah,
this is a pretty good one. And I'm in continuing conversations with the architect of that system. He and I have committed to having some really difficult ongoing conversations. Like, I wrote the book. He was not thrilled with the story I told about the system, and we had a bunch of really difficult phone calls. But he's been very open to continuing to talk about it. So I think part of the story that is important to answering your question of, like, where do we really get to solutions is about the links between criminality and poverty. And that's part of a bigger narrative in our country. And I think this is really the stuff we have to work on. This narrative in our country that poverty only happens to a tiny percentage of probably pathological people based on their choices, rather than understanding the reality that 51% of us at some point in our adult life will be below the poverty line. But so between 20 and 64, 51% of us will be below the poverty line. And a full 2/3 of us will access a means-tested public benefit. So that's not like reduced cost school lunches, that's welfare, right? But we speak about it as if like no one has ever done this before. Those of us who admit to it feel very isolated and stigmatized, right? Those folks who are still sort of locked in this idea that poverty is in itself a pathology, then end up thinking they're the only person who ever used the system correctly and everybody else is on the take, right? So there's all this work that needs to be done around this cultural narrative that doesn't understand poverty as what it is, which is the majority American experience. Not that we all experience it the same ways or that we're equally vulnerable to it is not true. Your race, your sexuality, your physical ability, your mental health status, whether or not you're caring for other people, whether or not you're born poor, all of that has huge impacts on whether or not you're going to end up poor and whether or not you're going to be able to escape it. But the reality is this is a majority condition. And this kind of moral diagnosis is not something that you do to people who are the majority, right? And so it relies on this story that this is a tiny percentage of pathological folks whose rights you don't have to respect.
And that fact is made more invisible by these opaque systems that essentially turn this into a scientific process that look like intervention for a pathological minority when it actually turns out to be a majority.
Yeah, and then it comes back to Dorothy Allen's insight, which is like, one, most of you are going to end up where I am, is one of the things she's saying. But two, even if you don't, the systems they test on us will get ported to everyone, right? And so one of the things I tell people to keep an eye on is if you look at the Trump administration's proposed budget, everybody's been talking about the cuts, and it's really important to pay attention to the cuts to social services in the new budget. The thing that I don't hear most people talking about, though, is that the administration proposes saving close to $200 billion in middle-class entitlement programs. So that's disability, unemployment, Social Security, Medicare, by increasing data surveillance, right? Including buying data from private data brokers. So that, I think, is a really clear sign that this stuff that has been tested for 50 years, really, on poor and working neighborhoods is on the spread.
For you.
Yeah. So it's a moment. We have a moment to intervene in that, and that's why I hope the book contributes to making use of that moment.
So we also have a moment for question and answer. And because specifically we are in the city of Cambridge, a city with a very high density of academics, and specifically dealing with academic density, I just want to remind everybody what a question is. A question is an interrogative statement that offers a query that Virginia could respond to in a way that would enable a certain amount of information transfer.
Funny.
If you find yourself saying something along the lines of, I guess this is really more of a comment, please sit back down, that was not a question. So if you do have a question, please put a hand up, and when I call on you, please introduce yourself and then offer that question for Virginia.
I actually, you mentioned, I spent the first 18 years of my life in poverty, where Section 8 inclusiveness and welfare and all that were part of my norm.
Good for you.
And social services were basically my norm, and things like privacy were not a thing. You basically threw data at the government just in hopes that they would give you what you need.
Yeah.
And then I became like a fancy tech person. So my question for you is, there are books like this that are so powerful, and there are many organizations, Media Lab, New America, et cetera, working in this. How do we get it into, how do we get this deep into the culture of the tech people building all this stuff? And not just having them, how do we just get it deeply into the entire culture and the fabric of all that is tech, whether it's the contractors or Facebook and Google? How do we crack that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a question I feel like you might know the answer to better than me, right? Because you've lived a little bit in both worlds, and that's actually really, really useful. So I want to give let people know about a book that might be equally interesting to on these privacy questions, which is, I don't know if folks know Kiara Bridges' book. It's called The Poverty of Privacy. And it's just brilliant on these questions of whether privacy is understood as a right for folks who are accessing public services, and it's brilliant. It's really, really brilliant. One of the things I hope the book will do is actually, to some degree, move us away from conversations about privacy, because I at least found in the conversations that I had with folks that privacy, for the reason you're talking about, probably wasn't in their first set of concerns, right? Like that was sort of it's not that people don't want privacy, it's just not an assumed condition in poor and working class neighborhoods, right? You are used to trading your information for benefits. So it wasn't the first thing people raised, it wasn't even the fifth thing people raised. So mostly what people raised with me were questions around self-determination and agency and having power in your own life. And so part of my work is to kind of try to shift the conversation away from privacy and towards these questions of how do we allow people to exercise their self-determination, right? Rather than this sort of more protective language of privacy. The question of how to crack tech culture, I think, is a really, really hard one. I think my personal theory of change is that things don't change until the people who are most affected band together and force things to change, right? So I really think we're in a moment where we're seeing some incredible social movement led by poor and working people. So the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign has been working since the 90s to shift people's conceptions of poverty in the way that I talk about. Right now, at the 50th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign and the building of Resurrection City in Washington, D.C., we're seeing this incredible sort of moral philosophy around poverty coming out of progressive churches, right? So I think we're actually in a moment where my personal work feels like feeding that moment, which doesn't mean that the other work isn't important. So I'm just... I'm more interested in hanging out with them than hanging out with Google is what it comes down to. So I think folks who are in positions of power will pay attention when we make them. And so for me, it's really about being part of movements that are pushing that. I understand that that's not everybody's role. But that's mine.
I
like my
did just want to add sort of a design suggestion, which comes from one of my favorite technology scholars, Virginia Eubanks. She has this book called Digital Dead End.
I do.
And in that book, one of the observations that she makes is that poor people are sort of often the victim of people using technology against them, and uses this very visual and real metaphor of a caseworker looking at a screen. And you, as the person receiving services, you don't get to see the screen. You don't get to see what information's there. And the design change that she suggests that you should really look into is if you put the screen here, and suddenly we have the possibility of looking at it together. And I think for what happens is many designers have never imagined themselves in the position of seeing the back of the screen. Yeah. And if you can get them to see that possibility of what if we're seeing the screen together and put them essentially on the same side of the people that they're ultimately serving, it goes a long way.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing and then we'll get some more questions in. But I also think from the tech side, there's probably some great conversations to be had around who's the client. Right? Like, so in these participatory design in LA and Pittsburgh was great in that they talked to caseworkers, but there was not much talking to the folks on the other side of the desk. And I also think we need to sort of widen who we think of in the community of data science, right? It's not just the people who are building the systems, but the people who are experiencing the systems firsthand, right? But that's, again, I think you need to do the cultural work to get to there, because part of the reason they're not there is we don't think people who are living in poverty have anything smart to say, right? Which is, of course, wrong, just dead wrong. So, yeah, I think there are things that can be done. Yeah, so I appreciate that.
In the Great Society in the 60s, the federal government established a mandate called maximum feasible participation. Why is that not being enforced so that the people who are the clients of these systems have to be part of designing them? Because isn't that still a federal mandate that's intact from the 60s?
Well, so yeah, that's again historical rabbit hole there. It's a good historical rabbit hole. But so the War on Poverty programs included this provision called maximum feasible participation of the poor in the programs that most have impacted their lives, and that's how we got Head Start. That's how we got legal aid. Like that's how we got all these actually deeply participatory policies and institutions was from the War on Poverty. The problem with maximum feasible participation of the poor, from the point of view of people who wrote that policy, is it worked. And so about 18 months after these programs rolled out, and there were actually like funded community development corporation or funded community development organizations that were run by poor and working people who were getting paid by the federal government to run them. All of a sudden they were like, hang on, why don't we all run for office? And then they just started shutting it down, right? They were like, no, that's not what we meant. Like, don't like take our jobs.
We didn't actually mean maximum.
Right, exactly. And so we backed off maximum feasible participation of the poor as a country pretty fast. It really only lasted about 18 months. Whether or not it's still settled policy, like that would be an interesting legal issue. I don't know how to respond to that. But I think that it's a beautiful thing to aim for, right? And it's clearly not something that's happening in the systems, most of the systems that we're building now. So thank you for that.
My question is about, I guess, algorithmic accountability in the sense that, optimistically speaking, there are a number of cities, or at least New York City, right, is now setting down a task force to think about this. And, one moment of accountability seems to be the design phase, but I just wonder if you are sort of asked to advise them on what that should really mean. What do you think that should mean in order to make sure that people are governed in sort of a way that democracy envisions, or in a way that's truly accountable?
Yeah, so there are these moves in several cities now. New York was the first, but it's happening in other places to create sort of public panels for algorithmic accountability or transparency or fairness. And I think that's an amazing place to start. I will say that I was at a meeting recently with some of the folks in New York, and we were talking about the book, and at the end they were like, maybe we're over focusing on transparency. Maybe that's not the thing. And I was like, yeah, maybe there's some other stuff we should be thinking about besides just knowing what's in it. Of course, we should know what's in them if they're running public policy. Like, yeah. But that is really just the bare minimum for reaching fairness. And I think we really need to get to a place where rather than saying, let's figure out what's in them and how they're having discriminatory impacts, that we're in a place where we say, let's build to disrupt the discriminatory impacts of the system already, right? Like that we're building from this point of view again, where if you put your car in neutral, it's going to go down the hill. Like, let's stop building in neutral. Like, let's build these systems with our values first. And that's efficiency, of course, is an important value, but it's not the only value, right? So self-determination and dignity, protecting people's legal rights, right? Rolling back constitutional rights because it's easy design-wise is a huge problem. So all of these things need to be part of the puzzle. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I'm super excited by these experiments. Yeah.
I think another piece of this is when you look at the design phase, you can work on questions like transparency and possible fairness. You may still find yourself in a situation of disparate impact. And the ways in which we pursued disparate impact as an audit strategy sort of becomes a response to a lot of these systems. But that also gets you into all sorts of problems about how much information can you have to audit. It's very hard to do a third-party audit of who's getting services, you know, for homelessness and relationship to reported drug addiction without having massive sort of privacy compromise associated with it.
Yeah.
Do we have time for one more quick one? Yeah, great.
Since you've talked about your book in other countries, from an international standpoint, are there other countries that we can look to that have sort of more functional systems that could be an example for us? Yeah. And do you think America is willing to do that?
Two very different questions, but really important ones. So most of the stories I hear are horror stories. So just in the horror story pocket, if people want non-American horror stories, people have been talking to me a lot about the Aadhaar system in India, which is biometric ID card that I don't understand a lot about yet, but I'm interested in knowing more about. And the other one is the Centrelink system in Australia, which just last year the government decided that they had paid out too much public benefits money, and they wanted to recover that money from the people they had given it to. So the Centrelink system produced all of these bills for people that then saddled them with thousands of dollars in debt. It's called the robo-debt scandal. If you want to look it up, it's pretty amazing. There's a really interesting resource online. It's called Not My Debt. And it's people's stories of this Centrelink experience. You know, I think the upshot of like how do we get to better systems for me, or part of the puzzle, and how do we get to better systems and what can we learn from other places, is I have to believe that a system of, say, national health care doesn't waste the incredible amount of time, resources, money, and human potential that we waste. And so when we talk about efficiency, that we can use other systems that have an economic human rights like orientation to say, like, well, how are we really defining efficiency? Like, is efficiency maximum output given all of the constraints that we're talking about on the input, or is it like a bigger question of how do we balance needs and desires in a society? Thank you. So that for me, that is that seems to be the big lesson. And also the big experience for me has just been being reminded that we're unusual, being reminded that this set of problems is a set of problems we gave ourselves. And the good news about that is we gave them to ourselves and we can fix them, right? Like, there are a set of political choices that we've made and we can unmake those political choices, right? And so, I mean, maybe that's a good place to leave it today. Like, but I really appreciate everybody being here. Go ahead.
So, Virginia's going to be here to sign copies of the book. I'm hoping she might start with my copy of the book. Before we do that, could we have a round of applause for...
Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you all so much for coming and for